Hello, this is Alex Burkett, and you are listening to the Long Game Podcast. In this episode, I'm chatting with David Baum. David is a 3-time founder and CEO in FinTech, MarTech, and Deep Tech, and he's currently working on Relato, a content ops software. He has a background in management and technology consulting and was head of strategy at the largest digital agency in the Nordics. Several exits later, he has invested in and advised many B2B SaaS startups and has in-depth knowledge of content marketing from the perspective of an investor, founder, and operator over 2 decades. This conversation spanned the pragmatic, so learnings about content operations, where it's broken, where it can be improved, the pieces of the puzzle, all the way through to the philosophical and existential. What's the value of information in a world where content is algorithmically generated as well as curated and delivered? This one was super fun for me. Without further ado, here is my conversation with David Baum. Why is content ops a problem we're solving?
Well, there are many problems that are worth solving in the world, and I think many people go hunting for the really tough ones. I've certainly done that. My background is in hard technological problems within regulated industries, as in fintech and financial technology. But this time around, I was actually looking for a really interesting medium problem to solve. Of all the problems you can solve, it's the medium ones that are really nice to start with, because you can actually create some results pretty quickly, and there are no sort of binary yes or no things in the marketplace as in regulated industries. I think it's worth solving because there has been so much change in the SaaS industry the last 3 or 4 years. First, of course, the pandemic, which fundamentally changed the way we work, the way teams are organized. And then the current downturn, hopefully picking up, really meant that many businesses have developed a new view on how they organize content and how they scale. At the same time, no one has really developed any proper software and tools to support that new way of working. And I think that's a massive opportunity. Then I'd love to understand the problem and develop a new generation of content operations software and tools that actually help businesses grow with the new way of working.
It's a very interesting time. I've worked in content SEO growth for, I guess, like a decade now, more or less. And it seems like the last couple of years, there's more of a scatter shot. Like people have strong opinions and ideas, but they're all in different directions nowadays, where it seemed like there may have been more of a consolidated playbook 7, 8 years ago. Like everybody sort of looked to HubSpot or Buffer or Unbounce or these MarTech companies who have built out inbound engines. Now, if you're on LinkedIn, everybody's got different opinions. You're like, high scale content production, use AI, build an audience, build a community, build a media brand, all of these different approaches. So it seems like it's a little bit in disarray. I don't know if you've discovered that as you've done your research.
Oh, yeah, certainly. I think there is a massive world of content operations that no one really talks about, and very few people, apart from all the people involved, know about. And that is, of course, enterprise content operations. People have been doing this for decades with massive deployments of systems that take years to configure and that work for thousands of people internally. So there's really a large field of operations and problems that have been solved for these large organizations. But at the other end of the scale, in B2B SaaS, I think there are 3 different approaches. Of course, you have the AI-first approach, which is, of course, relatively new, and I think it's in the process of imploding. And then you have the SEO-first approach, which I think has gathered speed the last decade and certainly has a bright future. But it's sort of, I think there's lots of risks there, especially as SEO-first melts with AI-first. That's where you really get the risky stuff. And then there's the third approach, which I'm certainly interested in, and is sort of the position I've taken, and that is the human internet. And it's sort of a reaction to the other two. There is no way forward for content marketing or content on the internet if everything is going to be replaced by an AI-driven SEO-first approach. There is no way you can train a new generation of large language models based on AI-generated content. It's like a gigantic snake eating its own tail, right? So there is, for Google and for all the other players in the market, we have to make sure that humans continue creating content for humans. Human beings have to continue storytelling, and that is what the internet has to be about. Otherwise, it will simply implode and die. There will be nothing worth reading, and most of the business models out there will disappear. So I think the third approach, which is human-first content, is certainly the most interesting one. I think it's also the only viable way forward.
You've hit on all the key pillars, and I'm so tempted right now because in the mornings I'm very existential and philosophical. So that last one, I'm tempted to dive right in, but I want to do a little table setting first. The idea of information and content and what's the value of information. We got to touch on that. Little table setting though. So what's your working definition of content operations? I think a lot of people may have different ideas of what that means. And I'm sure there are actually different definitions depending on if you're like IBM versus an early stage startup. But what's your definition?
Right. There are a number of sort of established industry definitions. It's the people and process and tools that are used to develop, collaborate, and distribute content for business purposes. Depending on where you come from, some of the players in the field, they come from a digital asset management background and a digital operation or a content operations platform as a sort of an add-on to that. Some take the CMS or the content management system as a point of departure and add workflow to it. My approach is to look at how people work together today and build software and tools to support that and help B2B SaaS scale developing content. And that is actually quite a different approach. It's kind of a niche, but it's also really, really big. I think most businesses that aren't in the B2B SaaS space have a lot to learn from lean teams who work together in this new way with a hybrid organization or remote first in many cases, and with tools, software and tools at every step of the way. So my definition, I think, of content operations is the new way of working based on software and tools to drive growth in B2B SaaS.
Yeah, in some ways, it's like you've got a high level objective, like where you want to go. There's where you currently stand in relation to that. And then there's a strategy that gets you there. It seems like the content operations is really like the boat or the airplane or the car that gets you through that destination, gets you the throughput needed to reach that objective.
Yeah, certainly. An interesting approach to it is just to think of it as a tool or a platform that has all the capabilities you need to do that. And I think a lot of the work that's been done with AI to plug in certain services along the way in a process means that there are so many opportunities to speed up, to increase the quality of the work done, to replace grunt work with smart services. But I think we have to take the approach that look at how people work today, look at how the most successful teams develop and distribute content and help them scale that to support business growth, to support strategic objectives for the business.
Well, I'd like to ask maybe a broadly, probably too generalizable question, which is what is wrong generally with the way brands are approaching content ops today?
That's a good question. I think there are many examples of brands that are doing a lot of really good things, who have made some hard choices and who have been extremely successful. There's certainly a wrong way of doing things. There are some awful examples of SEO heists and so on that I don't think we need to spend time on. But some of the problems today are really based on the good people who work in content and content ops. I think about 90% of the people I've spoken to, they have a liberal arts degree. Their dream was to work in journalism. They ended up writing content for business and enjoy that work and do a fantastic job. But they're really not interested in the software and the tools and the process optimization and the whatnot that you need to get the job done. There are a few examples of the opposite, but those are few and far between. So I think a lot of the problem today is that the work that is being done is mostly excellent, but it's really hard to speed up because there are no real software and tools or platforms that support the way people work today. And the ideas and development to actually build those tools, they haven't really come from the industry itself. I think we have lots of examples of pioneering content managers who build homegrown setups with low-code or no-code tools where you connect Kanban boards in Trello or Asana or ClickUp with Zaps and automations in Zapier, and you connect your email accounts and maybe a Slack integration and so on. And you end up with a sort of a mishmash of 10, 15 different tools working together, barely managing, but that actually does help to scale as content. But these setups really aren't robust. They're pretty brittle. And as soon as one credit card expires or one person leaves the company, suddenly a third of your process doesn't work anymore because it's connected to some of these personal assets and so on. So many businesses base the primary driver of their business growth on homemade solutions with chewing gums that are holding it all together at the back end.
We used to, sorry to interrupt, we used to call that the Frankenstack at HubSpot. And HubSpot obviously positioned themselves against the Frankenstack, which was like point solutions taped together. And if this stops working, you stop getting your emails in your CRM. So it was like, here's the all-in-one kind of seamless solution. But sorry, go ahead.
Well, there are approaches that sort of solve the problem well. But as far as I can see, there's maybe 2 or 3 next generation platforms that actually try to solve the problem. And all of the new players I've seen, they are very heavily SEO first. So they serve that bunch really well. I think that workflow is a kind of afterthought for many of them. It's maybe not that hard of a problem to solve, but there are certainly other ways to do it. And a lot of the problem lies in that these homegrown solutions, they sort of work, but they don't actually scale, or they scale to a point and then they stop scaling, and they're really brittle to change, both in the organization that runs them and to the tools and software that you sort of use. So I think it's about time that someone looks at how people work today, what the strategic goals are, and actually builds a new generation of platforms that address the needs in a proper way.
Yeah, well, one thing I thought was interesting the last time we chatted was in your research, you're focusing not just on the actions that people are looking to take or the goals they're hoping to accomplish, but on the people and the different archetypes who are using these systems. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there may be, let's say, 2 broad buckets of users. There's like the IC, which could be a freelance writer, a content writer, the person who's putting words on page or video or the creative together. And then there's sort of the content manager or director or the person kind of gluing together the strategy and maintaining the system. And one thing that you mentioned was there's a gulf between the problems that each party perceives they face, right? Like you said, the top 10 problems of a freelancer, the content manager's like, I don't resonate with any of that. So I thought that gulf just alone is pretty interesting. That feels like a pretty meaty area. So can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I'd actually add a third role to the mix. If you say you have the content manager mostly in-house with a brand, some of them are fractional as well, and consultants in their own right. And you have the content writers who do all the work of creating the content. There are also editors, and editors can be in-house, or they can be more of an advisory role. They can be a consultant or a freelancer. And of course, almost all content writers self-edit as well. But most of the mature stacks I've seen, or the mature setups I've seen, they have an editor as well. And as we were speaking about before, a lot of the problem arises when different people meet the process of creating content, experience friction or problems or subpar solutions, but don't have the opportunity to make a decision to fix it. And a prime example of that is when I speak to content managers, their problems are far more, let me say it another way. What they think about is, how can I understand my business's strategic goals, translate that into tactical actions that we can implement in our process, accelerate that, and get people to create those business outcomes.
Because they're going to be accountable for a number usually, right?
Yeah. Whereas a content writer, they receive assignments from maybe a dozen different content managers at a time. And their world is more or less invisible for the content manager. Content manager only has an understanding of the 1 or maybe 2 assignments that a content writer on their team gets at one time. So the content writer has about 3 or 4 tabs open for one client. And if the next client has a wholly different set of software and tools to manage their process, then they have 3 or 4 tabs open for that one too. And then they have the 11 or 12 tabs open for research for the one piece they're working on. Maybe they have to jump into another piece because feedback from an editor came ticking into their inbox. And suddenly you have about 50 or 60 tabs open just to manage 3.
And now you got to buy a more powerful MacBook to process all of this.
Yeah, a good case for Apple. So the pain experienced by the content writer really isn't anything the content writer can do much about. because of course they can't force one client to start using the tool stack of another. And the content manager really doesn't have visibility into that problem and really no incentive to fix it for them. And then again, you have the editor who maybe gets pulled in just at a single step of the process to review content. They, of course, have the same plethora of solutions and tabs open as the writer does, but don't really experience the problem in the same way because they're not working in that system all day. So their problems are different again. And I think there's sort of one positive in the whole mix, and that is everything mostly happens in Google Docs, which is a pretty good solution with excellent multiplayer mode and so on. However, if you chuck an agency into the mix, which often is the case, so B2B brands work with agencies who then source writing from freelancers, you get this weird situation where a brief is shared as a Google Doc by a brand to an agency and distributed onto a freelancer. The freelancer clicks to access the brief to get started working and is, of course, met with a prompt that says you don't have access to this because you're logged in with a different account for a different client or whatever. And that generates an email to someone who really doesn't understand it and doesn't have the authority to actually grant access because they're at the agency, and then the ball sort of starts rolling. And you end up spending maybe minutes for each task you do, which sum up to maybe hours at least during a month. And in a year, you've spent about 3 or 4 days that are trying to fix all the broken links and access rights. And that is just a typical problem that if you start summing up all the wasted time for a team of 10 or 15 freelancers, 2 agencies, a content manager, and an in-house editor, you've suddenly spent several weeks just on managing a broken tool set. I understand that this is sort of nerd material for process optimization, but it's sort of when you zoom out and see all the people working on the same kind of problems with the same frictions, and that really just motivates me to find a way to solve that problem.
It sounds like a very frustrating entanglement of a whole lot of overhead. And the frustrating part is it doesn't feel like there's any obvious solution from like a single party in this system, right? It seems like the system itself created this emergent property of a bunch of entanglement just because there's so many different project management tools, because there's multiple cooks in the kitchen, even with a single client, right? Like from the agency perspective, there are early stage startups and sometimes there's too few cooks in the kitchen. So the founder is going to be going in and editing content, briefing in the agency, and then they're trying to raise money. They're trying to do all the other things too. That's like one side of the spectrum. And then you get up to enterprise organizations where, you've got potentially an SEO specialist team. You've got the point of contact. You've got like probably a dozen stakeholders in the system and then your own tools too. So it just seems like there is like maybe an over-complication or over-engineering of what should maybe be a more streamlined, maybe like 7-node system has turned into this massive kind of jungle. I'm kind of rambling now, but does that resonate with what you've seen?
Well, no, that's absolutely the case. And I've seen quite a few. It's sort of a new role that has emerged, and that is the automation consultant. There's actually lots of business to be done where content managers, they understand that their headspace is, but they want to spend their time on understanding strategy and translating that into content strategy, and making sure that their writers actually produce content that achieves business goals and creates business outcomes. And if they simultaneously have to spend half of their week setting up content operations by integrating systems and tools, then it's really hard to manage that. Many content managers are, in addition to all that, tasked with writing a few pieces a week as well. So there's sort of an emerging industry for the automation expert, who, of course, I think Zapier even has a certification for consultancies and consultants. So, and they help B2B SaaS to set up these systems. So, which is it's a kind of, I spend most of my year in Norway, and there's a saying in Norwegian, I don't think there's an English equivalent to it. I'll try and just translate it. This could go really badly. They say it's like peeing in your pants to stay warm. It sort of solves a problem for a short period of time. But in the long run, you end up with having to maintain a system that you haven't created or configured yourself. And it's, of course, a massive lock-in for the sort of configuration or the automation consultant. So you sort of end up with a new person on your team instead of buying a proper system. And that's guaranteed going to cost way more than just buying a B2B SaaS that sort of solves your problems for you.
One thing I found interesting about that, so like this integrator or automator, right? Like their direct responsibility is to reduce waste in the system and hopefully make it easier for the people to do the work that is meaningful. But in the context of the content manager, you mentioned that they don't even know this world that the freelancer lives in. They don't even see the complexity. They don't even see the wasted time trying to get access to this image, this document, this brief, etc. So there's almost a visibility problem in that they don't know what they don't know. Maybe if they saw a system where they're like, hey, 45% of your time throughout your entire system, editors, freelancers, et cetera, isn't even going towards the work that's going to tangibly affect the results that you're accountable for, right? So they don't even see that this is a problem in the first place.
Yeah. These multiple steps of lost in translation are very, very obvious when it comes to the work the editor does. I've spoken with many editors over the last weeks, and most of them say that my primary objective is to translate business strategy to content and help the content writer to actually create a piece that does the job that the manager wants. And that is, of course, an important job. But the real problem here is that the content writer is no part to that discussion when a brief is created. They're a couple of steps removed from the actual strategy. So the editor ends up doing a translation job for the brand and helping the content writer understand what job they actually need to do. And of course, that is why many brands are really afraid of churning their best writers, because the best writers are, of course, the ones who understand business strategy and without increasing their price too much, keep on delivering excellent work that actually delivers those business outcomes. And you can only fix content that much with a really good editor because of that translation problem. So I think this is also an area where a proper tool should be able to assist. It's almost a question of making the most important information available in a consumable manner at the right time for the people involved, instead of all the clutter of emails with brand guidelines and business strategies and various login accounts for demos and access to systems to understand product and business strategy. There are just so many ways that this information is shared and moved around along the production chain that it becomes really frustrating and hard to manage in an efficient and rational way for the content manager. And the job is unnecessarily hard for the content writer as well.
It is very complicated. I'm getting into like personal territory, but it's like back in the day when I would write articles, like none of this existed. Like the content ops ecosystem was very thin. And you as a writer would be asked to pitch the idea, to do the outline. There was no briefs. Like if there was a brief, it was like, hey, here's a keyword we're trying to hit. Try to sprinkle it into the copy a little bit. And then fast forward to many years later, it feels like things have been over-engineered to the extent that the writer, if they do have deep subject matter expertise, if say they've been writing about Google Analytics for 8 years, they can't even flex that knowledge because everything has been so scoped in and you've got a 20-page brand guideline that, frankly, like I'm not going to read. Writers aren't going to read that. Maybe they will, but like it's an overabundance of information. And then you're like, can I just write about the things that I know and I do and I have contacts that I can interview? It just feels like there is a lot of like shackles in terms of like what your best writers are capable of doing on their own.
Yeah, I think excellent point. I've definitely met that problem head on when I speak with writers and with managers. I think the internet is full of articles about how important a content brief is, but there are other perspectives on it. You can see people taking a completely different stance and say that if a writer can't take a keyword and run with it and create an excellent piece of content, then they aren't a very good content writer. There are people who have that opinion, and I'm pretty far from agreeing with that. However, part of the problem is that just getting a keyword and running with it will not produce very good content, or at best, it will produce content that is good for a search audience, meaning that you're creating content that you desperately want someone to read, but you really don't have anything to say, right? Whereas the opposite stance would be, here is an extremely interesting perspective fronted by a very interesting person that really has something to say and they're passionate about it. Reach out to them, interview them, understand the problem and their position, and write a piece based on that. That would be a situation where I would sort of accept the premise that if you have a really interesting SME with an interesting stance on a problem and to create content based on that, I think that probably should be the hallmark of a great writer, and most great writers could do that. That's also why I've seen many processes that are geared towards understanding or using voice of the customer data. Could be transcripts from calls or reviews or testimonials or whatever, and using that to generate content ideas. And I think that's an example of a similar thing, even though, of course, a customer isn't necessarily an expert, but it does give you a unique view, and it gives you a number of unique voices and perspectives on a problem. And I think that is, of course, the human approach to creating content. That is the way to create unique and interesting content. And the amount of ideas you can generate from that approach are limitless. Whereas SEO, of course, is highly competitive, and there are limits to what you can do.
This is such a cool topic area for me. It's like I'm seeing it visually in terms of a spectrum, in terms of like centralization versus decentralization. And so my background is in more of experimentation or conversion rate optimization, and we would talk about different org structures for that, right? There's the centralized program where a centralized CRO team owns experimentation. They come up with the ideas. Maybe they source ideas, but you as a SEO specialist, you're not going to run your own experiment, right? Like it's very tightly wound. Quality control is high, but you don't get as many ideas. You don't get as much emergent innovation. There's not as much alpha maybe. And then the other side was decentralized. And that was where there's no centralized organization, no quality control. Every team runs their own experiments. And of course, the velocity goes up because everybody kind of runs it as they will. But then, some teams are very sophisticated with their stats. Some aren't. Some ideas are great. Some aren't. And then you get this patchwork of sometimes not brand guidelines, like, you're not following those. And it's like this system is a little chaotic. So obviously there's different answers depending on the organization and your taste for risk and innovation. But it seems like that's really the spectrum we're talking about where, give your writers free will. They can write about whatever they want. You're not going to have much quality control, brand voice, et cetera. You wind it up too tightly and you're probably not going to be as innovative. There's probably not going to be as many emergent ideas from the people who are actually working with the SMEs.
Yeah. Well, I always get so disappointed when I've Googled something, I land on an article, and after just reading a few words or maybe a sentence or two, you get this feeling either that this is just an SEO optimized piece of writing. It's one of 1,000 very similar pieces. You sort of flick into skim mode. You start scrolling quickly. Could be a comparison post or something like that. And I think it's okay. But if you were made to believe that it's something else, then you get really disappointed. Similarly, you get even more disappointed. Or I actually almost get angry when you find out that this is just AI generated content, because you get that really. It's an awful feeling of someone has written something without really having anything to say. Right? They desperately want an audience, but they have no opinion. And there is no one actually with an opinion behind this content. And I just stop reading it. And I think it's often the same with, a similar problem with all content, that you have to have an opinion. You have to have something you want to say, and there has to be something you want to achieve. That can be the same with any other kind of activities in a business, be it innovation. If you don't manage people well, and they're highly motivated, they're going to generate lots of ideas and lots of outcomes will happen. But if they aren't strongly informed about the strategy and where you want to go at a high level, then they won't create the outcomes you're looking for. However, if you ask critically, what is a brand voice? What is a brand? And how does that develop over time? Many businesses, they do a brand refresh, but often that refresh comes from the top. But in many organizations, brands evolve as new parts of the business succeed. And that success isn't always something that is sort of a directive that comes from the top. It's a really highly motivated team that have uncovered an opportunity and that suddenly takes off and starts to grow and becomes important or even more important than some of the older activities or lines of business. And because maybe that new line of business that is growing so well addresses a new customer segment, talks in a new way to people, relates to customers in a new way, that really becomes the impetus for developing the brand. And it's really quite organic. I think that is almost the same for content as well. So if you manage to convey your strategy and your goals really well to an experienced writer, you'd be surprised how they actually help you develop your brand through their writing by creating new experiences for an audience. I think that is maybe the best way to discover and work with new writers and let their voice be heard, meaning that you actually end up with unique human voices that are interesting and inspiring to read for your audience. And it's pretty clear that this is written by someone who isn't maybe part of an in-house team, but it's interesting to read all the same, and it's valuable, and it's helpful.
And from the reader perspective, it's so refreshing once you stumble upon something like that, as opposed to the copycat, similarity content that you see everywhere else. You're like, finally, somebody with an opinion, somebody with experience. This is great.
Certainly. And the difference is that you'll read it instead of skimming it.
One hot take that you mentioned when we chatted last, and you mentioned it earlier in the conversation too, is that SEO first is the most risky approach to B2B content marketing. I'm not sure many would describe SEO first content as risky. That word risky is not what I would like, even if they're not for it, even if they don't like SEO first, even if they don't like, getting a keyword in a clear scope report, I feel like they would usually call it safe, right? So I'm very curious about the framing of this being the riskiest approach.
Right. For me, SEO is so much more than keyword research as the driving force behind content briefing, right? I think a keyword is always useful to have when you create content. And I certainly believe that there's value in creating content for a search audience. But I do think the uncertainty online now with how Google interprets the way forward for their business model has introduced an enormous amount of risk into doing content the way we've done it for the last 10, 12 years. I think in 2014, 15, 16, it was so much fun doing SEO first. You could rank within a day. There was so much opportunity and the competition was so low in many really valuable niches. Of course, that world has changed fundamentally. Today, it's fiercely competitive, and which means that you really have to invest a lot to create an impact. You have to produce an enormous amount of content, and you have to have a high velocity. You have to update it regularly. You need a pretty big rig to be able to play in the world of SEO first. And that is really why I mean it's risky, because the business outcomes are as insecure as they were. SEO heists aside, there is real competition for places 1, 2, and 3. And only the last 3 years, Google has added another ad to the top. So now there's 4. There's features snippets. There's people also ask. There's video emerging. So the way SERPs look is also pretty volatile. And my expectation is that that's going to continue to change. And, well, who knows what search generative experience is going to look like in the end. I'm not even sure if Google knows what they want to do there. I certainly know that they want to do something, but I think they're anticipating what the competition is doing. And I think everyone who uses Perplexity for search understands that you can really create something valuable and different. But I'm not sure what the solution will be. But that is also a risk, that there's going to be even less room for organic content in the SERPs, or the way organic content emerges in the SERPs is going to be pretty volatile. There's going to be new solutions. And if you assess that risk in light of the investment you have to take in order to compete, that is where I feel pretty comfortable saying that it's really risky. What isn't risky is SME first content or interesting perspective content. It doesn't even have to be a contrarian view. It just has to be a unique voice. There are other approaches that are variants of SEO first. For example, the linkable asset or linkable content strategy, which of course is an SEO tactic, but it's a very clear subcategory. I'd say that that's perhaps less risky than the sort of keyword. Maybe I should have called it keyword first SEO.
Yeah, or like I think everybody knows what we're talking about, which is just like the crappy, like generic, like only writing for SEO, like taking a clear scope or a surfer score, not caring about the substance of the content and just saying, all right, we hit an 80, we're going to go live. Like that style. I think, we can, people tend to know what we're talking about, like recipe websites or something like that. Like we all have an idea of what that means.
Yeah. I think you find a lot of them in affiliate marketing, all the blogs within affiliate marketing. Many of the large ones have been hit. And most of the creator players within affiliate marketing have been outcompeted by the large brands with high domain ratings. Take Forbes, for example. Is it the top 10 washing machines of 2024? I didn't know that was a Forbes category, but it apparently is.
That does annoy me, by the way, with Forbes just taking like all these different verticals. It's like, I don't know if this is good for the user, but we'll see. It is the era of volatility in search, so hopefully they'll solve some of that.
Yeah, certainly. I think the old way of doing it is you find a keyword, you upload it, you find some alternatives on Ahrefs, you sort by difficulty and filter by volume, and you sort of develop a strategy based on that. I think that is, of course, a tactic that may work in some niches, but I definitely wouldn't be betting on it going forward.
I mean, I think like the simplistic, like the dumbed down version of this, the content on its own has to be good, regardless of how you're going to distribute it. And in that way, like regardless of where Google goes with SGE, with any sort of feature snippets, or however search evolves in the future, I'm optimistic specifically about search because no longer can you get away, or hopefully in the future, you can no longer get away with just SEO content, that crappy SEO content. It's got to be good. It's almost like the increased competition makes me think of like, so I'm lived in Austin, Texas. And the thing about Austin is you go to a barbecue place and it's going to be good because there's so much good barbecue that if you have bad barbecue, you're simply not going to exist for too long, right? So you can maintain a level of confidence that because of all of the competition, and it's known for barbecue, right? That if you go to a place, it's got to be above a certain bar. And hopefully content in the future, hopefully in search in the future, we can raise our standards and say, if it's good enough to rank now, it's probably got, double lead signals. It's probably like experience based. It's probably interwoven with subject matter expertise. It's definitely not at that state right now. Like we've seen a whole bunch of bad search results, but hopefully in the future, that's the way things go. That's my optimistic take.
Yeah, that'd be a beautiful and bright future. But yeah, hoping you're right.
Well, that leads me to the next point this is probably the most interesting thing on your podcast intake form that you also mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, saving the human internet. Obviously, we're talking about generative AI for the most part. That's the looming figure in this space because it's robotic content. So your phrase was the problem with generative AI and content marketing and why we need to save the human internet. So that phrase, that mission-oriented phrase, save the human internet, piqued my interest. So tell me more. What's worth saving?
The human internet isn't my term. I didn't coin it, and I see many people using the term. But to give context, I grew up on the internet, like many people in my generation. I love the place, and it's both maddening and saddening to see the internet flooded with AI-generated content produced by people who are only interested in generating traffic. Sometimes I think it's infuriating. That isn't a productive sentiment, of course, but the problem is that as the internet is flooded with AI-generated content, it will suddenly start to overtake the human content on the internet, meaning an enormous problem for the people who develop the solutions that actually generate that content. There is no way that you can train the next generation of large language models on predominantly AI content. Synthetic training data aside, you actually need human content to train better models. We can, of course, optimize the models we already have. There are many ways to do that, but there is going to be a new generation of models in the future that will need even more human content. Now, video, of course, is underutilized currently, and I'm sure there's a vast amount of value that we can get from that to train new models. But written content, which has, of course, been the object of generative AI so far, we just have to have human content. And beside the point of having content to train models on, every aspect of being online is, of course, an expression for human creativity and sharing, and the whole vision of Google to enable or to make available all the world's information to everyone is, of course, based on people creating information and sharing information. So I really don't see a way forward without the human internet continuing. And generative AI is a direct threat to that. And there is really no way today to assess whether or not something is AI generated. Even OpenAI, I think they removed the model they had originally created to classify content as AI generated or not. There are a couple of businesses who claim that they can classify, but most of the advanced models actually fail at detecting AI generated content. There are solutions that inject human-like errors into content in order to fake being human. You sort of add double dots or double spaces and spelling errors and such. But that is, of course, easier to detect. But the future of the human internet is really relies on a way to classify content as human or not. And I haven't seen any techniques or projects that have managed to do that yet. It's vital that something emerges soon.
So one other thought that I feel like is related to this idea, because I agree with everything you said about the human takes, the human element of the internet. I certainly don't want to live in a world where everything is algorithmically delivered and written. But something I've been pondering on is there seems like there is a lot of cynicism in content now, or people are jaded a little bit. And I was listening to a Tim Ferriss podcast. It was with Noah Kagan. And they were talking about sort of what's next. Like, oh, here's where we came from. We were bloggers. You did a podcast. I built this company, AppSumo. Like, where are you looking next? And Tim had a really interesting take around YouTube specifically, but he is hesitant to go into any space that he feels has been, that there have been a convergence of best practices. So it's predictable, right? Like there's less variance. Like there's a certain set or a certain formula to rank on search in Google. The same is true with LinkedIn. The same is true. Like I was in the gym the other day and I just wrote a LinkedIn post about this, but I wanted a playlist based on a certain artist. And I went to the artist radio and I noticed that it said made for you. And I was like, oh, interesting. So like I picked this artist and that's maybe like the prompt. But then based on all of my past data, they took artists that I've already listened to and songs that I've already listened to. So I didn't discover anything new. And it frustrated me because I'm like, I actually wanted new stuff. I didn't want the same algorithmically delivered for me, like perfectly converged set of songs, right? So I feel like there's something is wrong with the fact that everything is designed just to give us exactly what the system thinks we want, because then it incentivizes creators to create for that purpose versus what they would authentically have created if it were in a world, say, of the early internet or even the stumble upon era, where there was a little bit more randomness, right? Like you don't want everything to be random because then, it's hard to find anything. Like findability is good, accessibility is good. But it seems like there's something with the algorithms and the platforms that we're all playing on, we're all living on nowadays too.
I'm sure that you follow Lenny's podcast. At least Daniel Ek, the founder of and CEO of Spotify, he was on Lenny's podcast, I think it was August or so last year. And he spoke about this, exactly the problem of exploring and finding new content and how hard that problem is to solve for. I don't think they've solved it. So I think you're right. But I do know that they're trying. But a certain school of thought says that creativity is really just a way of recombining existing knowledge. So a lot of sort of creativity workshop techniques involve understanding a couple of problems, injecting something contrarian or new or whatnot. Yeah, you know more about this than I do. And based on that, coming up with something completely new. I think what that approach misses is serendipity. And there really is no good algorithm for serendipity. Things just emerge because you're curious or you expose yourself to some kind of environment and something just shows up. Of course, that is an impossible problem to solve for an algorithm, at least currently. And if Spotify can't do it, I think they've thrown quite a lot of resources at this, and they certainly have the data set to help you discover something completely new. But I have exactly the same experience. I have an additional problem, and that is my kids use my Spotify account all the time. So most of the stuff that shows up is really not stuff I'd want to share right on my public platform.
Yeah, well, on a tangent there, like I always listen to Spotify when I'm reading or doing light work. So I'll listen to a lot of classical music. And I'm like, I don't really want to be recommended new classical music on Release Radar or on my Discovery Weekly, right? Like I wish you could partition it out. But yeah, it's interesting. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm in the minority. And I think maybe a lot of people do want more customized for you type solutions. But even when I'm traveling, even with cities, like I really enjoy like the discoverability and the randomness of a city like Paris. New York City's got a lot of that too. Whereas like you go to other cities and they feel like every city, there's nothing truly novel about it. The skyline looks the same. The restaurant set is the same. It feels a little bit like Groundhog Day.
Mm. Well, moving that problem to content, I suppose maybe Google should have a box called Contrarian Views or surprising perspectives or something like that. But I really don't think there's a business model around that, because the joy of discovering something new isn't, if it's too frequent, then it just feels chaotic, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I suppose that's part of the problem. Is it's sort of hard to build a data set on what works and what doesn't as well, because it's pretty scarce.
Well, to me, it goes back to incentives. And this is potentially like the hardest question or the hardest territory we're entering. But in the sense of a content marketer, like, how are you going to make the choice to be aberrant? In a business sense, if you can write with AI and it's 5 times easier, and you can rank with maybe like 80% of the success rate of truly pouring your heart and soul into every piece, incentive wise, like, how are you going to choose the human route, you know?
Yeah. I suppose the scarceness of organic hits on the SERPs does sort of solve some of the problem. There is really no point in having an 8th or 9th place, because about 75% of the traffic goes to position 1, 2, and 3, right? I'm not quite sure of the numbers, but it's something like that. So achieving 80% of the best in that competition really doesn't cut it.
This has been a fascinating discussion. I really appreciate this. We did the pragmatic stuff. We talked content ops, but we also waded into the philosophical, existential territory. So that's the mark of a good podcast for me. Thank you so much. Where do you want to point people online? What do you want to pitch? Where do you want to send people?
Yeah, please check out relato.com and please connect with me on LinkedIn, David Baum. I'm pretty easy to find. That's currently the channel we use most to spread our thoughts.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Likewise.